Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about good books because it's weekend. So yeah, if you're new here, welcome. I'm Raf. I talk about books and sometimes other stuff. If you like it here, like, subscribe, comment, do the wonderful things, share this video. If you've been here for a long time, thank you for sticking with me. I know it must be hard. I appreciate it a lot. And since this is a weekend, I'm talking about books that I read on a weekend. That's not The Wheel of Time. I'll be back to that grind tomorrow with The Gathering Storm. We're getting close to the end. But today we're going to talk about Hollow by Brian Catling, and we'll do the usual thing, which is, me giving a bit of like a summary, non-spoiler kind of why y'all should go and read this damn book, and then we'll go into a discussion of some of its themes and stuff, and why I was so impacted by it, which I was. I read it, yesterday and today, and holy shit, that one, it's a trip, is what it is. So yeah, that's what we're going to do today, and now it's time to say thanks, and cheers and all of that. And this one goes out to Iskar Jarak, best sergeant in the Unabridged Burners, best Malaz tuber out there, one of the longest running Malaz tubers out there, wonderful person, runs the best Discord that I'm in right now. If you want to talk to me about books and stuff, maybe join that one. This one's for you, Sarge. Cheers. So yeah, if you want to be personally cheered or want me to drink a very specific beer, why not join my Patreon? There's no obligations there. You'll get all the videos anyway. There's no paywall in that regard. It's just like if you feel like a little appreciation. I would love that, but once again, don't feel obliged. But if you do, I might knit you a hat or a scarf. Just saying. Anyway, let's get into the book, right? Okay, Brian Catling is something of a unique author. He's an artist, and one that has done all kinds of art. Sculpture, painting, I guess a bit of poetry here and there, performance art, the lot. And then at the ripe old age of 50-something, I feel, something like that, he started writing fantasy books. And he wrote an amazing trilogy that's out there. It's The Vorrh, and I'll maybe go and reread it at some point. I certainly have a lot of questions ever since I read that trilogy. It's very unique, and yeah. Once again, I might look at it at some later date. And now last year in June, he wrote, or released, Hollow. It's a short one, and if I had read it last year, it would certainly have ended up in my non-existent top 10 of fantastic books I read last year. And yeah, it's a masterpiece for all kinds of reasons. But what is it actually about? Well, it follows Brian Catling's general way of writing fantasy. That is historical fantasy, magic realism kind of stories. They are set in our world, in the past of our world, and deal with intrusions of the fantastic, of the phantasmagoric, and the weird into our world. With the Vorrh, that was mostly Central Africa and a bit of England and a little bit of Germany in both the 19th and 20th century, the early onset of the Nazi regime in Germany, and its implications on colonies in Africa, and all kinds of other stuff. With this one, it's the 16th century Europe, Western Europe, mostly what is called the Lowlands, which is parts of Belgium and the Netherlands, of course. So it's not just the Netherlands. And, well, that's sort of where we're at right now with this book. And, well, there's other stuff there, weird phantasmagorical elements that we're going to talk about in the near future. On, the surface, there's 3 main plot lines. One of them is about a group of mercenaries that have to transport a magical oracle from Germany to a monastery that is apparently somewhere in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries. And it's weird and dark fantasy in that regard, following, the kinds of, Solomon Kane or actual stories like the Adventures of Simplicissimus, which is a famous book from the 17th century Germany about the 30 Years' War. It follows those in that plot line. Then we have a plot line about a peasant rebellion, a female peasant rebellion in the Netherlands or Belgium. And we have a third one that is about the monastery to which those mercenaries are slowly wandering with their oracle, where the old oracle has died and the new oracle has to be placed. And, well, several monks trying to figure out what is going on. That's the three main plot lines. It's really weird, it's really dark, and it's extremely surreal and fantastic. So yeah, that's what we get there. It has overwhelming prose that goes all over the place. It has very grotesque imagery, and it has a lot of like really deep themes in there. And it's an absolute trip to read. So yes, you should go and do that. It's a short book, however. It's, somewhere around 300 pages, I think. The audiobook is like 8 hours. It's nothing. There's longer Terry Pratchett books out there, is what I'm trying to say here. So you can just go and read that book and then be back quick and we'll talk about why it's such a fantastic book. And in the meantime, I'll just have a bit of a beer here. And those of you who don't want to, read the book right now or have already read, well, you can just have a beer with me, right? All right, glad you're back. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me hear what you thought of the book in the comments. And now let's talk about why this book is so unique and what it does and the way it does these things. And I'll start out with saying that the plot is not the point of this book. I feel the plot, and it's absolutely not its strength. The plot is just there to connect these like set pieces almost. And you can see that when you look at how the structure runs, right? Like every single chapter has, like most of the chapters have the point of showing one weird absurdity, one weird grotesquerie, before we're moving on to a different viewpoint and a different weird thing. They're almost like miniatures, in the painting side of miniatures, I guess. Which I think brings us to the first big thing that this book does, and it comes to the interdisciplinary approach or like background of Bryan Catling. And my thesis is that this book is about art, why there is art, how we appreciate art or consume art or whatever you want to use there, how art affects us, and so forth. That's how we communicate with art is the big theme of this book, and we'll go through that bit by bit. So the first bit there is that obviously these stories are, the story itself, the world is influenced, inspired, heavily connected to Dutch painting or Flemish painting of the 16th century. Peter Bruegel and mostly Hieronymus Bosch. Both of them are often mentioned Bruegel is not mentioned in this book explicitly, but there are several scenes that are references to some of his paintings. And there are obviously also references to Hieronymus Bosch paintings, very explicitly with Bosch. So what Catling does here is certainly using sometimes a very visual way of writing. It's something I've spoken about when I talked about Terry Pratchett, using also like a very visual approach, sometimes like painting pictures in the mind with words that you can visualize, and then you get something more out of it than just the description. And Catling does this here as well. And I feel this is like a key, or like a first approach into the mystery of Hollow. And that is the problem of communication. The problem of communication between arts, right? So we're having someone writing a book that is about paintings, about graphics, about like visual art. And there is always a disconnect here, right? There's always a disconnect when we talk about art. There is... you can never describe a picture in words and fully recreate that. There's the saying of like a picture says more than 1,000 words. Yeah, but on the other hand, thousands of words can also say more than a picture. There is that disconnect, that gap, that abyss of communication, and we'll go back to that in a second. So Catling wrestles with that, obviously, practically, when he talks about describing scenes that are scenes out of paintings of Bruegel or Bosch and others. But he also makes that part of a central metaphor of the book, and that is the mountain. The mountain Das Kagel. Let me explain. So, the mountain at whose foot the monastery is situated. That's the word. Is situated. Is also rumored to be the ruins of the Tower of Babel. And this is where these two worlds, the world of words and the world of images, collide. There, at the beginning, in the first chapter, we have a scene, right, when Captain Follett. I wonder if Follett's name here is a sly dig at Ken Follett and his medieval novels, historical novels. Just saying, might be, might not be, whatever. So Captain Follett remembers how he got the job to transport the Oracle, and he got shown an image of the Tower of Babel, a miniature, and it's a reference to a very specific Tower of Babel image painting by Bruegel. So there we have the image, but on the other hand, we have the crushed remains of it, the mountain, and we learn during the novel that the mountain is actually, and the Tower of Babel used to be a library. Now, those of you who have read Borges, you remember what I'm talking about here, right? What this is referencing is the Library of Babel by Jorge Luis Borges, whom you should go and read, because holy shit, that man had a weird imagination, and this makes a lot of sense in the context of this book. So we're talking about the Library of Babel, and what we see here is exactly where we have the world of words, the Library of Babel, the reference to Borges, one of the most imaginative writers of the 20th century, being at the same time that Tower of Babel, that painting, that visual painting, but it's deformed. It's no longer the tower. It's no longer the library. It is crushed. It's a mountain. There is, misunderstanding there, which is signified by those animals, right? The filthlings and woebegots that creep through the ruins of that understanding and devour it and misunderstand it more. It symbolizes, or you can read it as a symbol. You can read it as an allegory to our misunderstanding when we try to understand art, and how there will never be full knowledge. How devouring masses of it will not give us any more appreciation of it. And how there is always conflict when you try to translate from one form of art to another form of art. And at the same time, the mountain, through the tunnel that our mercenaries are going, is also the connection between the outside world and the inside world of Das Kagel toward the rest of Europe, of the less deformed, less surreal, less phantasmagoric part of the world to this other one. It is very much a pressure. We'll talk about pressure in a second, right? It is very much that connection, and it leads to it is always a deformation that happens there. So yeah, a very powerful symbol right there at the core of the novel, at the story, the mountain that was a library and a tower. And how those connections will lead to all kinds of to a big mess, basically. And there's other borders, right? Another border that we talk about here a lot is, or that's always in the background, is the glandula misericordia, the border between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living. That constant fight where the skeletons are trying to keep the living in and herd them into the realm of the dead. That is another one of those borders where two worlds collide. The world of words and the world of images collides in Das Kagel. The world of the real and the world of surreal collides between those two as well. The world of the living and the world of the dead collide at the glandula, at that border, in that eternal battle. Because borders always are about conflict in a way. They're about conflict and communication. And communication at borders, at gaps, will always lead to some loss or some deformity, I guess. A huge theme in this book. Now let's look at the next one. And it kind of still comes to the same thing, which is that understanding and the way understanding works. Because if we watch images, if we watch pictures, paintings in this case, when we try to communicate about them, we need to do it in the world in the form of words. And that can never really work out. And there's a remarkable scene in this book. There's a remarkable scene where our friars Benedict and Dominic come to this house, to the chapel, and see two images, two paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, and encounter our presbyter Cornelius, who is a much learned man, a scholar, well, more an academic, I guess. And they talk about one of them, the Nassau triptych image, and Cornelius, in a almost comic way, describes the painting and its magnificence in very technical terms. It reads like a contemporary piece of art criticism where you talk about the technique, and you can see the control over the lines that he has, the more improved technique that he has, all of these things he talks. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it reads very much like the sort of learned criticism of both literature or paintings that you could read in, your highbrow newspapers, for example. When people try to explain something about a piece of art by focusing on its technique, on the technique of the artist. And Brother Benedict makes fun of it or is pissed off by it. But there is that like ironic level to it that only the artist can, I guess only the artist can muster, because the artist obviously knows or feels what he's trying to do with a painting and can then smile in derision at the critic trying to figure it out and not finding the words. But there's a second level to it here, especially with Benedict and Dominic, because they, at least Benedict, figures out a meaning. And the word here is revelation. We need to talk about revelation in this context. And that I feel is the powerful thing that this book does. The understanding that Benedict gets from watching the Hieronymus Bosch paintings is revelatory in nature. It is a very personal thing, that spark of knowledge, that spark of understanding, jumping the gap between the artwork and his mind and his personality and his understanding. And revelation is always personal. God, the divine, whatever you want to call it, right, speaks to that one chosen one in the desert through the burning bush, or whatever they do, gods being gods and all of that, right? What happens is that revelation is that spark that jumps the gap between two minds, between art and watcher in that case, right? And we'll never know how much of that understanding comes from which side, but it arrives out of somewhere beyond the rational. It's the super rational, the intuitive in a way, and that's how art works. That's why art, paintings, sculptures, books, movies can touch us somewhere that goes way beyond just sitting there and saying, yes, the way the prose is built is technically proficient. The control over the lines in the painting is exquisite. The way the lighting and the camera view are handled in this movie is highly proficient. No, they touch us on an emotional level that only revelation can give us. Which, in this case, makes a lot of sense that we use a monk, or two monks in this case, religious people, as the example there, because there is something similar. There's a similarity between faith, not faith, but like the way we approach faith and the way we approach art. Because at the end of the day, we need to take that meaning that we get from a piece of art at faith We need to take that at faith. We need to believe that that is what the artist wanted to tell us. Just as when we have a personal revelation, we need to believe and trust that that is what God wanted to tell us, if God exists. You know what I mean? So the idea of revelation as the way to find meaning in art is a very strong one and a very powerful one. And one that I feel we can see in this book in a lot of ways. All right, big one. Now let's look at the next big thing here, because this book is very much about art and other things. The question now is, where does art come from? And this is where we need to talk about the character of Meg, or Dull Gret, which, you know, is a Dutch or Flemish folktale. There's a picture, there's a painting by Bruegel of her called Dull Gret, or Mad Meg in English, apparently. And part of this story leads to how this picture, or how the scene depicted in that painting actually came to be. Now, the interesting thing here is that art is something of a relief of pressure in the way that Catling depicts it. And we've spoken about that before. Like pressure, the building up of pressure and the relief that comes afterwards is a huge thing in these pages, in this book. The gland is exactly that, right? The glandula misericordia is, according to this book, there in the real world to relieve the pressure of suffering, of misery, that the eternal fact of mortality exists, right? We try to ignore the fact that life is, you know, finite, that there is suffering, that there is a lot of suffering in the world. We plaster our civilization, we plaster all of these things over it to ignore the suffering all the time. But that builds up, that pressure builds up, and in this world, the glandula misericordia, is there in our world, in our human and living world, to, you know, relieve that pressure. It's where those two worlds connect in that warped bit there, where pressure breaks its, you know, where the pressure breaks its course and comes out. And that's an image for how art works, because looking at, you know, the paintings of Bruegel and Bosch and the 16th century in the Low Countries, the Spanish Netherlands in particular, that's a very, very dark time, and the character of Meg kind of shows that in a lot of ways. In an, you know, almost absurdist, slightly humorous, grotesque way of doing it, of depiction, obviously. But it does that. It's like life is a lot of suffering. Life is grim, well, nasty, shortish, brutish and short, and a lot of other stuff. Especially in Meg's case, if you're a woman, you're subject to all kinds of suffering all the time. At the same time, you know, the Netherlands, a Protestant country at the time, under the occupation of the Spanish, very Catholic, the Spanish Inquisition, all the willful destruction and insanity of military rule and occupation, that leads to a lot of pressure building up, and finding a lens through which to look at that, finding a language to explain that, is exactly what happens afterwards, right? It's exactly why you find the absurdity, the grotesquerie in your Boschs, in your Bruegels, and that kind of stuff. It's one of the ways where you can explain how we drift from the real into the surreal, into the super real. It's when we have no other way to, you know, show and share our despair, our suffering, all of that, all of these dark things, all of these dark emotions, when they break the bonds of language and other forms of expression, that's when we turn to art, that's when we turn to sculpture, that's when we turn to music, that's when we turn to paintings. And at the same time, we also find the mechanisms that society has built to relieve that pressure, right? The carnival of Meg's storyline, the carnival where her husband debauches himself, and everyone debauches themselves before they go into Lent. is exactly that. Carnival is exactly that. It's that pressure valve in society for like the load of misrule for like a couple of days, right? You go and do all the crazy things so you can afterwards behave normally afterwards. But the question is like, if you can't use that pressure valve, if you can't use that gland, what happens then? And then this kind of art happens, I guess. Now, the third part of it, obviously, is the storyline of the brethren and the way of gap, bridging that gap in another way. The bridging the gap here is at Abbot Celestine, who's trying to become immortal, to bridge that gap between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. And we learn that that obviously does not end well for him. But it's another attempt of bridging that gap, because if we know one thing from our human life, it's like we feel that gap, we feel that abyss where we can't communicate everything we feel to anyone else, where we try to find ways to do that. It's part of human striving in general. And this book deals with that in all of these aspects. The way of like knowing things and then using them or not using them. The way the church gathers all kind of knowledge and then does use it or does not use it. It's one of those smaller bits that we find here. The way of like a naive, intuitive look at things, as Friar Dominic does, or the way of a scholarly but still open to like actual faith, to actual intuitive perception, the way Friar Benedict does. That's one way of approaching it. Or the idea of controlling it, like Abbot Celestine, which leads in the wrong way. Because, communication is never about control. It's about accepting, but being open to appreciation. I guess we need to look at a bunch of other things. One of them, obviously, being the Oracle. Now, the Oracle is a very interesting comment on history and historiography and what we can learn from it. Right? The Oracle is supposed to tell or foretell the future, but the Oracle is fed on the sins, on the gross sins, very explicit gross sins of all those men that transport it, because they have to tell their stories to the bones, so they are steeped in evil and sin, and then the marrow is fed to the Oracle. And the Oracle then speaks in their tongues. So all the future this Oracle foretells is based on the terrible things that happened in the past. Will it learn anything from it? We don't know, because if that's your entire experience, is the crimes, the terrible atrocities of the past, all you will do is like regurgitate them and not actually imagine a brighter, different future. And that's a pretty sad assessment, but it's sort of implicitly in there. And it's one of those like smaller bits in here that I feel make it so fascinating to read this book and learn things from it. So before we end this, there's just like a few final things that I want to look at. One of them is Catling's imagination. Now, this book is obviously influenced by the paintings. We have these creatures from your Boschs and Bruegels and whatnot. But it does more than that. It certainly breaks the mold of the fantastic in a lot of ways that you find in a lot of classic fantasy, even horror fantasy. You don't find that kind of stuff. You find it sometimes in the things that someone like China Miéville is writing. You find it with Jeff Vandermeer, definitely. And it's that reintroduction or like reconjuring of the absurd, of the grotesque into modern fantasy literature that I really appreciate, because it's taxing. It's not always easy to read. It's disturbing, but it does do something. It's very, very difficult to ignore. It's a kind of book that just like grabs you at the throat and just screams at you, and you're like, yeah, I have to take note. I have to think. I have to figure it out. And it's something that you learn here. And you also see the same with the prose. The prose of this book is broken. It's lyrical. It follows its kind of rhythms, but it breaks the rhythms. It changes from like speaking about these and thous and whatnot into like gross obscenity. Dialogues don't make any sense. And that once again reflects that idea of that gap of communication that is so difficult to bridge and that can only be bridged by an intuitive leap. Even in that way, it shows up. Even in that way. So yeah, what a ride. I hope you enjoyed the book. Let me know what you thought about it. I'd really love to talk about it. It's the kind of thing that I feel we need to communicate about, because it's very difficult to just read it on your own. I might have just, fucked it all up and misunderstood everything about it. But I'm glad I read it. And yeah, I wish you all a really good weekend, rest of the weekend. I'll talk to you tomorrow about the gathering storm and all these other wonderful things. Thanks for watching. See ya. Cheers.